Hi, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of Bar of the Conference. I'm your host, Derek Scott III. Today's episode is with Neal Christie. Neal is a United Methodist Elder currently serving in the Baltimore-Washington Annual Conference. After many years at the General Board of Church and Society, Neal continues to work in many areas throughout the UMC connection, including co-convening the Love Your Neighbor Coalition, leading an intern program for college students, and participating on the Christmas Covenant team. He currently works with congregations in the Northeastern jurisdiction on conflict transformation and equipping clergy and laity with tools for reconciliation. In this episode, you'll clearly hear Neal's passion for the church and for its work of justice throughout the world. We barely scratched the surface of his early years as a child of immigrant parents from India and Pakistan, and we quickly moved to his formative years and call to ministry. As we talk through Neal's story and his reflections on all that has happened in our denomination, you can hear his vision for the church's role in transforming the world. Since he has experienced so many parts of our connection, he's able to speak to the worldwide nature of the UMC while also understanding our nuances and diversity. We cover a lot of ground in this interview, and yet there's so much that we didn't get to. You're going to need that notebook, and yeah, you should probably grab that choice beverage. So let's listen to this really good interview with Neal Christie. Neal Christie, how you doing today, my friend?
I am well, Derek. How are you doing?
I'm good, and I'm excited to have you on the podcast. I just feel like you are a wealth of information and experience and exposure, especially around some of the critical issues that we are facing as a denomination. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about those things. But I want to always start sort of at the beginning. Would love to just hear how God's prevenient grace brought you into the United Methodist Church and how you became a United Methodist Christian.
Yeah. So it's interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I dropped my daughter off on Malcolm X Boulevard in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. And I took my spouse, Lois, and my daughter past the church, Bethelship, now United Methodist Church. But historically, it was called Bethelship Norwegian Methodist Church. Now, why do I say this? So my family immigrated from India and Pakistan in the early 1960s. And the first place that my parents lived was a brownstone in what was predominantly a Norwegian neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, which had shifted. So we started having Indians, South Asians, as well as Puerto Ricans coming into the neighborhood, and African Americans, so a larger Black population too. So this was a shifting community. So my memories are of climbing up the steps of that urban church in Brooklyn, New York, and hearing, the liturgy in Norwegian and in English, then playing with a kid, who's Indian, who's Black, who's Puerto Rican. And for me, that was sort of my introduction to the Methodist Church, was as an immigrant. And my whole family have immigrated, or the immigrants. And so we are now all over different parts of the world, but that's where I began. And I was baptized there, and they welcomed my parents. And so I like to say the hospitality that was shown to us as immigrants, that I've never forgotten that, because it was not manufactured or artificial or required. It was just part of the fabric of that congregation. And I remember going to speak at a church in Oslo, and after the worship service was a meal on house folk, and the pastor, my friend Hilda Marie, now teaches in the seminary there, she said, Neal, talk to them, tell them your story. And I did. And I said, thank you for welcoming us. And they came up to me and they said, we want to thank you because our church was dying. And we didn't have the Methodist Church. And it became irrelevant. It wasn't involved in the community. your church came back and evangelized Scandinavia, and so engaged the gospel with the people. So thank you, because it was you all gave back to us. And I've never forgotten that, because they opened the doors for us, immigrants themselves. And then I was going to thank them. And they said, no, your church came back and helped us open the doors for our own people. And our people now are diverse people that come from all over the world, from Africa, across Asia, and they're coming into the church. So, I think I've always been part of the United Methodist Church. It was and I think I've heard this from so many different people who've had similar experiences. For me, it was a safe place, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a place where on Sundays we would be. My dad worked 2-3 jobs to make it. My mom took care of the family. And it was the one place we were together, actually.
Yeah.
We didn't always have time to eat together because of my dad's work. So church was it. And so that was the day. And walking the halls of some churches, I could just feel God was there and I was safe. And it wasn't always like that in school. In the neighborhoods where we grew up in after being in Brooklyn, New York, in rural areas where we moved, where we were the only brown kids. So it was not, the hellish experience that we hear from from people that I can empathize, because some of those were my experiences growing up in the mid 1960s to the early 70s, mid 70s, where it's just not, we didn't belong. So that was it. And so trying to find that space in church was so important. And it was different there. It wasn't perfect. It was never perfect, but it was different for us. So
Neal, I'm curious, what inspired your parents to land in that congregation? Had they been connected to Methodism prior to that?
Sure. Yep. So my dad and mom both, my family are converts from Hinduism and Jainism. And so we can track when the conversions happened. One of my great grandfathers, Lalubai, which means red, he was a chef for missionaries, and he was not a high caste Hindu. He was a lower caste Hindu, and he converted. And so the whole family just sort of slowly converted with him. My other side of the family were Jains in Gujarat state in the western part of India. They also converted. And the challenge, I think, when I've gone back to India as a child and then now as an adult, it's like to be a Christian in India when you're such a small minority with, hundreds of millions of people, it's a big deal. Like, to be a Christian means your lifestyle is very different. And so you don't celebrate the festivals. You don't, you don't do the rituals. So it's a very different worldview and expectation. So you stand out and it means something. So for my parents, when they came to the US and immigrated, it would make sense. The very first thing you do is look for a United Methodist Church. And through connections in the Methodist Church in India, they had some sense of where to go. And it was the pastor of that church remained friends with my parents until my father is now 90. And they stayed friends until they all passed. My father's still living. The others, my mother now has passed on. And both of those pastors from 1960 pastor and spouse have passed on. But their kids, we learned what Thanksgiving was from them, right? American food, American customs. It's like you learn these things when you don't, who's going to teach you? So you have people from church, especially a pastor, is willing to open the door for us. That's what made the difference. And and then, growing up, I was very blessed, like so many people, youth group. I had teachers from Jamaica, Switzerland, Guyana. There was a very, very diverse, multiracial congregation. I wouldn't say we were actively anti-racist, but we were living into what does it mean to be a multiracial community. And that shaped me, because it's like I can't go back. I can't ever go back. And so any ministry settings where I've been in with a dominant racial group, particularly white communities, to me, that's a full cross-cultural immersion. It's like, how do I translate my own life experience and then now what I've learned to do ministry in these contexts? And I've done it in very rural areas, where I was the only one. And there's consequences for that in some communities, right? Things happen. Things happen that I can go into those stories if you're interested. But what it was like pastoring churches in all white communities, but so it shaped me.
Well, take me on that journey to your call to ministry.
Sure. So as a teenager, youth group, of course, I went on a mission trip to Haiti when I was maybe 16, 17. And for me, I kind of did have a conversion experience in the sense that we were building churches and schools in the Lakai area near St. George, a community called St. George in the mountains. And I remember going to Grace Methodist Hospital where children with tuberculosis were there and receiving care. And I remember their smiles. I still remember. And I remember playing with them on the ground and having them jump on my back and pretend I was a horse and just fully embracing them. And for the first time, I really sensed God in church, and I would have my conversations in the playground with God. I sensed Christ fully alive and present with these children who really were experiencing severe poverty and health vulnerability, challenges. But I saw Christ, and I saw Christ among them and in them. And for me, it drew me to, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean to serve? What does mercy ministry look like? What is compassion ministry? Then I was an intern at Church and Society for a summer as a college student, and then as an intern with our offices at the United Nations, and was working on matters around the death penalty, gambling, human rights research at the UN. Then Global Ministries, I was an intern. I worked in a prison, 2 prisons, one known as Sing Sing, it's called Ossining. It's a maximum security prison with folks who are studying theology. And all of this is when I was in college. I worked in a warehouse to put myself through college. I did on Fridays, I was in prison, and I had my internships. And so I was immersing myself in the church beyond the local church. I was blessed to have these experiences. But I still didn't feel a call to ministry. I went to divinity school. I attended Yale Divinity School. In the 3rd year, after having gone on many retreats, Catholic monasteries, believing that I was definitely going to become a human rights attorney, that's what I was called to do. My 3rd year in divinity school, I was in the kitchen, and I felt God say, you need to go to a local church. You need to celebrate the sacraments, offer the sacraments, and be with the people. And that's when I started to pursue formally ordained ministry. And I never questioned that. And I was like, my life would have been very, very different because of the commitments I have and the kind of education I was receiving. So I thought, am I going to teach? Am I going to practice law, study law? It was like, go to the parish, go to local church. So, and I served local churches in the Greater New Jersey Conference. I was in school. I was in the South Bronx. I was in Harlem. I was in Hartford running food pantries. It was the beginning of the AIDS pandemic. Folks didn't even know what was causing AIDS. And so we were running a food pantry, trying to figure that out. But then when I went to a local church, very rural setting, it was a question of rich people and poor people, young families with a lot of resources, and then farmers who sold their land too cheap and who were living, which I found out, day to day, basically month to month. But it was a great opportunity to be in ministry. And it's that part of central New Jersey, sort of the northern tip of Appalachia. So it opened my eyes. I was committed to 12-step programs. So we had 3 12-step programs in that church, a Christian counseling church center that I began, Vacation Bible School they hadn't had in 40 years. We started it. I love Vacation Bible School. So for me, the local church was my way to express my ministry, my ordained ministry. And then there was a position at Church and Society that came open for a seminar designer, and back in 1996. So I was discerning, where do I go? I ended up coming to Washington, D.C. I stayed at Church Society for 24 years in 3 different positions. Then I've now worked with the conference for 2 years, doing all sorts of other wonderful things, and now I'm where I'm at. That gives you a sense of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, it's so good. We're going to slow walk back a little bit because I've got some questions. Want to hear a little bit more along the way. I'm curious, like, you had these internships and you're serving in prisons, but none of this is because I feel like I'm going to be a pastor. Like,
no.
Like, so what was the motivation? Point. What was the motivation?
Curiosity. That it was liberation. And in prison, we would read Cohn, we would read Bonhoeffer. We would talk about life choices and responsibility and oppressive systems. And this is before I was in seminary. I mean, so for me, I was really, thank you, God, because I was given those opportunities and that was what I chose to do. You know, my friends thought it was a little weird, but I had normal non-church friends, but it's like my mentor, he was a chaplain and he was like, come with me on Fridays, man, you're going to love it. And it's like, yep. And I learned, and these men held me accountable. And it was a program called Exodus. And so then it aligned itself with New York Theological Seminary. They were offering masters in theology to folks that are serving in prison. So Greenhaven Prison and in Ossining. And then when I was in college in New York, I invited my professors to even come with me and to learn from these men. So for me, that was another conversion experience. Is like, what is life like in incarceration? And so that was it. But I wasn't called to ordain ministry. I was like, no, why would I want that? Why would you want me to do that? I mean, let's be straight. It's like, there are so many different options.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And even in divinity school, my friends were getting ready to teach, work with nonprofits. I didn't know. I just was studying what I wanted to study and feeling, what do you want me to do? And I was open.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So on this journey, Neal, particularly as you are, you're in that kitchen, you hear your call to ministry, with some clarity there. Why United Methodism?
So, yeah, it's a great question. So in a sense, this is where I'm also blessed in that I did not go to a United Methodist school, right?
Yeah,
I went to a school with a lot of Episcopalians, a lot of Catholics. We had UCC folk. So there were all these options. And even when I was in seminary, I worked in churches, like from running a food pantry or working in the South Bronx working with organizers there during the summer and part of my fall. But I didn't work in pastoral roles. I avoided it as much as I could. I still remember one pastor would say, I'll take you on pastoral visits with me. And it was like, that was it. It's like, I didn't feel like, what can I do? What do you do in a pastoral visit? Now, I love that. It's like one-on-ones with folk. I live for that. I live for it. But back then I was like, no, I don't feel adequate. I didn't feel it was my gift. But what really convinced me to be in the United Methodist Church were 2 things. Number one, I attended United Methodist churches I didn't feel welcome in. So I'm not going to lie. I'll be straight with it. I was just not welcome. And I was becoming more and more politically active on campus.
Yeah.
So the dean at the time, who was attending United Methodist Church, it was not let's just say it wasn't comfortable. So it was like, which church do I go to? So my friend Scott, who teaches at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Kentucky, he's the chair of the Black Studies program there. He said, Neal, and he grew up United Methodist. And it was like, he said, we've got to connect with the United Methodist Church. This is our second year in school. So we started going to the Black Church at Yale. So it was the Black Church for me, as someone who's Indian, that I felt most welcome. Absolutely the most welcome by these young students, where I felt like they weren't looking at me, they weren't judging me or expecting anything of me. And the spirituality of being in that community that worshiped in the round and students took turns preaching, grounded me. So it was in the Black church that I felt welcome back into the church in a way. But it wasn't United Methodist, but there were a lot of United Methodists there. Second piece is I read the social principles again. So even though I'm reading theology, and I'm doing graduate work, I'm taking classes at law, I'm doing all this academic stuff, I went back to the social principles and I realized by my third year, I am definitely United Methodist. The social principles convinced me. So it wasn't just picking them up once. This was after studying theology, almost 3 years. I went back to them and said, this is what I believe. So why am I not choose it? Why don't I stay open to staying in the United Methodist Church? And in my history, I've had Methodist missionaries that went to Pakistan, Afghanistan, back at the turn of the century, the early 1900s, medical missionaries. So the Methodist Church made that difference to my ancestors. Okay, but for me, it was like, well, what do I choose? What do I choose? I was attracted to Catholic spirituality. Is that an option for me? The liturgy is important for me. I'm traditional in that sense. I'm Orthodox, but politically, I'm very progressive. So where do I fit? And the United Methodist Church was the one place that I found could be my home, that could hold it all together. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And it resonates. There are, I think, many of us who we're United Methodist in some respects because we didn't fit in other denominations because of the varied theological and social commitments that we're holding.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's not the first time I've heard someone say, I read the social principles and all of a sudden I knew where my home was.
Yep.
So yeah, I appreciate you unpacking that a little bit. Neal, as you think about your call to ministry, were there individuals who mentored you and inspired you on your journey?
Yep. It's always the Sunday school teachers.
Yep.
There's always the Sunday school teachers, some of whom's names I need to admit I don't remember, some I do. Mr. Ruger was from Switzerland originally. Mary, who was from Jamaica, she was a teacher by vocation. But my Sunday school teachers, my colleague Jack, who is outspoken in our conference, who called, truth. He spoke truth to power and took the consequences, whatever they may be, really encouraged me, held me accountable at times, but opened doors for me, had me sitting at tables where it's like, I didn't know what was happening, but said, come to this church and society meeting. And I'm 19 years old and I'm listening to them have these conversations. Like I'm not there yet. It's a very different reality, but there are people who are willing to do that for me. And I'm grateful for them. I'm grateful for folks even in my, so it's local church mentors, but also colleagues in the general church. So my supervisor, friend, and mentor, one of them I will name is Jim Winkler, who was General Secretary of Church and Society for more than 12 years and began as a friend who showed me how do you work in annual conferences? What do you do to, how do you pursue justice by connecting with people, building relationships with people in the church? But he is and was a prophetic leader in church and society. And when it came to the war, the U.S. war in Iraq, war, the inability for our country to stop preparing for war and pull itself out from places where we are at war, he was outspoken and worked ecumenically and interfaith. And I have deep respect for him for that work because it took its toll. Not everyone in the church is kind when it comes to justice ministry. So But I've had mentors in conferences and local churches that have been. Mary Boughton, my first church, who was the matriarch of the church, who had tea with me every week and held me accountable. It praised me, but also held me accountable and said, how are you doing with this and that? I love Mary. She was the matriarch, and she different theologically from where I was coming from, but we cared about each other. So
yeah.
Wow. And professors. I've been blessed. I had excellent professors. Some names that you know, some you don't. The name Cornel West, people know, but and he was one of my professors. But there are people like Sean Copeland, who came right after Cornell, who taught me for almost 3 years. Brilliant theologian, Catholic nun, African American, who taught both Black theology, feminist theology, sort of the start of womanist theology, but really opened my eyes to Catholic, again, to just a larger worldview through different theological, political and theological readings of the classics, and then how do you make this contemporary? So Letty Russell, who was one of my mentors also in seminary, who was tremendous and globally respected for her work in creating a household theology, which she called a household theology, the household of freedom. And it's one of the first of the feminist theologians that mentored so many people. So these were people I'm deeply, deeply grateful for. Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So Neal, so much of your story centers around the General Board of Church and Society. We jumped in and jumped around.
There, right?
24 years there? Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah, it's a long time.
So tell me about those first days for you working at the General Board.
So back then, staff was larger. We had more financial resources, I think. But that didn't matter to me back then. What I cared about is creating ministry. And so for 6 years, I was a seminar designer, which meant that I would create experiential educational opportunities for college students, high school students, for adults. Back then, United Methodist women's groups, intergenerational groups on poverty, immigration, all the issues we're dealing with today. I mean, very few of them have changed. I think back to when I was an intern at Church Society, civil war was happening in Latin America, so Nicaragua and El Salvador were on the map. But that back when I was started at Church and Society, Palestine, but when I was in college, South Africa, apartheid was, how do you dismantle apartheid was on the map. Well, back in the early mid-1990s, after having pastored in a church, been a hospital chaplain, done some of the things I've explained, here I am working with kids and young people and adults from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Maine and Missouri, and then expanding that to work with groups that came from the Philippines, and then traveling to teach the social principles or to lead workshops on social justice issues around the globe. For me, it was creative, liberating. You're opening people's eyes for the first time to some of the issues. Yeah, so you're building conscientization. You're building the ability to how to see things, shift the way we see things together, and to do it in a way that's not doesn't shut down. Folks don't shut down, but they open up. Yeah. So for me, social justice education, but to do it with a sensitivity to where spirit is, was really important. So it wasn't just about promoting social justice. It was about where God is incarnationally. Where's Jesus in this? Where do we really see Jesus in this? What else is true? And that was all important for me. And, I did, and I loved it. And then I became the supervisor for the program, and we expanded it. But back then, I think our country was definitely several things. Number one, our country was not as divided as it is today. Christian nationalism is not what we hear today either. That was not a challenge in our churches, I don't think, to the level it is today. And I think that is a challenge now. matters around racial justice were on the table, but we had not yet, we had the vocabulary, but we didn't always have the history. We had history from sort of movements, social justice movements, but we didn't look at housing, right? We didn't look at education. We didn't look at redlining, right? We didn't look at wealth building. So we didn't look at how racism, systemic racism through public policy has maintained itself and grown to get us to the place where we are, where we have such deep divisions and between people of color and white majority communities, or rich and poor. And so the issues are similar to what we have today, but I feel like we were going in deep analysis, but we didn't have all the resources. People were still doing the work, the research. I think that back then, again, I was very fortunate. I still remember one group I worked with were kids from Northern Ireland. So they're Catholic and Protestant, who typically would have never worked together. They were brought here for the summer for immersions together. And we were able to meet with Hillary Clinton at the White House because she heard about the poems that my kids were working on. And she had heard that we were doing this seminar, said, well, you're United Methodist, you're doing this great work, come and meet with me. So we had, the doors were open for those kinds of experiences. So you could have these aha moments, but you'd also do the grassroots work needed to do social justice education. And that's what it was like for me back then. I knew how to take people I live in Washington, D.C., so going to the Latin American Youth Center or going to an urban farm in Anacostia and taking white kids or multiracial group of kids to a predominantly Black community and predominantly Latino community was something that I riffed off of. I love that. It's like music. You play, you move with it, you create something, and you end with something beautiful where some movement has happened inside. Yeah. And so I think the challenge for me with that kind of ministry, though, is, okay, how do you sustain it? And that kind of led me to other forms of ministry in church and society, which is working with our organizers or working a little more on public policy education, or let's spend time talking about the social principles in greater depth. And in the early years when I was there, I was working with the revision of the Social Creed, the anniversary of the Social Creed. We spent 4 years traveling the world, working with folks for the first time to hear their voices and what does the Social Creed sound like to you? Does it reflect your reality? So I moved from more this level experiential education to, okay, let me see if we can create community, but how is this going to have a little different kind of an impact, almost like a policy impact within the church, theologically, but then also in some public policy issues. So I shifted somewhat. So revision of the Social Creed for 4 years, and then after hiatus, revision of the social principles for 8 years. And that took me into conversations on every aspect of life that's reflected in the social principles. So all along the way, trying to do my part to mentor people who will come after me, and see what continue to grow. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's take a quick break. So Neal, this podcast, I always ask folks at this point in the conversation about how they felt about General Conference 2019. And I ask because I believe that it's a important moment in the life of our denomination. I think that the history books will lift up many important moments, but that definitely, the passage of the traditional plan will be seen as an important moment for our denomination. So I'm just curious, to the degree that you want to share, what was your personal response to the passage of the traditional plan at the special session in 2019?
For me, it was a wake-up call to the church in several ways. And then I'll share my own personal experience. So it's a wake-up call in the sense that I feel like we saw least some of us saw, how narratives could be manipulated by political actors and theological actors, how they could manipulate through fear enough constituents to tip the majority. Because it was not a strong majority that voted for the traditional plan, right? They tipped it, and they did it out of fear. They also convinced those who are unfamiliar with the nuance and diversity of the United Methodist Church that there is there's a mythological mono voice, one voice in the United Methodist Church, which has never existed. But they convince the external world that nope, the United Methodist Church believes this, has a very restrictive understanding when it comes to ordination, human sexuality, same-gender committed and loving relationships, and the role of ordained ministry, what's possible and what's not possible. So they convince the outside world. So when I'm walking through the park and I have persons who are Muslim and Jewish say to me, I am so sorry what happened to your church in 2019. And that's what happened. People who have no knowledge of the Methodist Church would come up to me lamenting the decision. And I'd ask them, how much do you really know about the Methodist Church? And they said, very limited. But based on how the media is portraying this, my heart goes out to you, because I know this doesn't reflect your values. So I feel like the political, there was a win politically there that was a wake-up call, number one. Number two, the traditional plan suggests that there's one view of how to be church, which is not accurate. We've always been diverse in our theology, in our way we define and work our relationships, do the work in our relationships. It's not always reflected in the positions of the church. And so this codified the most restrictive, most punitive, legalistic form of church that does not reflect where I think the majority of United Methodists are, whether you're in the United States or Africa or the Philippines or Europe. So I don't think it reflects who we are. And we have an opportunity to change it, to actually be more truthful now. So now personally, what impact did it have? I felt embarrassed, frankly, because this is not the way that I relate to my friends, my family, and those I'm in ministry with as a pastor and as in pastoral roles with people. I may not be pastoring a church right now, but I'm always a pastor. So when people talk to me, this doesn't reflect who I am.
Yeah. Wow.
It doesn't reflect who I am. And it doesn't reflect who my children are. So this is not a church that my children see themselves in if we maintain the traditional plan. And that's the truth for a whole generation. Right? So. And
were you serving at the agency at the time?
I was. And I at that point, we had finished the revision of the social principles, the 8-year process. So I had built even more relationships across sub-Saharan Africa, the Philippines, Europe, the jurisdictions across the United States. And I had conversations with people, very intimate, direct conversations, hard conversations on the hard issues, including human sexuality. So after having gone through that whole process, then to face the 2019, where we've now completed almost all of the revised social principles. We held off on 2 pieces, is one on human sexuality and one on marriage, till after 2019. But all that work had been done, Derek. So being part of all those conversations, taking those notes, listening, processing, agreeing, disagreeing, finding common points, values, so that we have the document. And then going to 2019 and seeing how the manipulation, the fear. That was not was reflected in that beautiful work that we did for those 8 years together. So deflated, right? Fearful for my siblings. What does this say not only to our siblings in the church, but outside the church? When they're not, they don't identify as Christian, but a Christian church behaves this way? That's unacceptable to me. Yeah. It's harmful to those who are non-Christian. So that's how I experienced 2019. Political manipulation, disappointment, and fear for my sisters and my siblings who see the church behave in such a way.
One of the reasons that I do think that the passage of the traditional plan is an important moment is because of the ways that it seemed to, depending on who you're talking to, wake up some parts of our denomination, galvanize some parts of our denomination, some individuals, some groups. And we saw a very quick response to the traditional plan as we headed out of the special session and into annual conference season. And particularly in parts of the Southeast and the South Central jurisdictions, we saw, in my conference here in the Florida Conference, we saw some very, very intentional actions around the election of delegates for the next quadrennium as a response to the passage of the traditional plan, as well as some resolutions from conferences saying essentially that they would not be abiding by it. And I'm just wondering, from your place in a church society, but as an organizer, I'm curious what that felt like to you, just sort of looking across the landscape of our U.S. connection as we were watching sort of these things happen. Did you have any feelings about that, or was it more like exactly what should have happened, or was it surprising? How did you
wish this happened earlier? I think folks that had stood on the sidelines decided to come to the middle, right? And so I'm drawing an analogy here. Is during the Black Lives Matter marches taking place. And I was in Washington, D.C. I was in different parts of D.C., but primarily near the White House as those marches were happening. My children, my daughter, my son, my daughter in college, my son in high school were participating. And they saw students that would not have participated, but because it was Black Lives Matter and because what it stood for, they joined. These were folks that otherwise would have been on the sidelines. But this is a matter of life and death. This is not an option, friends. We have to take a stand. And I saw United Methodist, good, loving, compassionate, mercy-driven, feed the hungry, clothe the naked United Methodists, but who would not really take a stand for advocacy necessarily, moving from the sideline to the center. And they became public with their voice alongside folks that have been in this struggle for years for full inclusion. And to me, that's hopeful. It's really hopeful. It's a challenge because we have different cultural expectations and styles of working together, but it feels hopeful. And I've seen more and more people who would otherwise stand on the side coming to the middle, to the center, where we can do some good work together and pass the resolutions that need to be passed. So we now have in the across the globe, in my opinion, I think that we have a different perspective than we did going into 2019. Even talking to delegates who had personal opinions and yet who may have maintained the status quo, they certainly didn't want to become even more accusatory and litigious, right? They would have been like, yeah, let's take some moderate steps, but they certainly didn't want to. But they saw what happened. And so now those same people are willing to say no. wait a second. We have to come up with an alternative so that we can agree to disagree, and we do not dehumanize and demonize one group of people because of their identity. And so I think that I've seen sort of a sea change kind of from 2019 with more people getting involved. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the resolutions passed at the annual conference level that we saw. We wouldn't see the support, I think, for regionalization, the Christmas covenant that we've seen, which gives the freedom for the church to organize itself in a way that we can move beyond this sort of these limited, litigious, persecutorial positions, that we have the freedom to respect our differences and to allow ministry to occur, life-giving ministry to occur. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it totally does. Totally does. So I think from there, usually I, start asking folks about, the things that happened right after the annual conference season, protocol, and then COVID, delays of general conference and that kind of thing. But I have to go in a different direction with you, Neal, because you have had some direct interactions with some specific pieces that are coming to our next general conference. And one of those is your relationship with the Christmas Covenant team and the broader conversation around regionalization. And I'd love to hear how you got involved with the Christmas Covenant team. And then let's just take it from there. So yeah, how did you connect to that work?
Yeah, so it was by invitation, really. I read the original, the legislation. I really paid attention to the values first, because compared to the other, possibilities, the other petitions, legislation that would become petitions, they didn't begin with values. They kind of didn't begin with what we stand for. There was not an affirmation of our theological task, our doctrinal history, that we are called to engage that. That's our DNA. It's like to think theologically and critically and constructively first, in partnership with people's lived experience. It's like that's where it starts. And it was not sort of a quick fix piece of legislation. So that's what attracted me in the language I saw. And then came the proposals and the constitutional changes. And then it was through personal invitation. So by seeing the original authors of the Christmas Covenant who I had built relationships with over the years and trust with, I knew that it was not one region that was putting it forth, that the central conferences were coming together. These were leaders and emerging leaders who wanted a way out of this impasse. And whether it's Norway or Zimbabwe, Liberia, Congo, Philippines, I knew these folks, my sisters and brothers, I knew them. And so I trusted them. And then I was invited in to be part of the US team. And I think it's humbling in the sense that the Christmas Covenant really reflected the vision of the central conferences, and it's a gift to the United Methodist Church from our central conferences. And so I'm not used to being in the position of receiving a gift. I like to be the gift giver, Derek. Yeah. Okay, I love giving gifts. I love to cook meals for people. I love to make gifts. I love to give gifts if I can, to show you hospitality. So to have central conference leaders say, this is our gift to the United Methodist Church, you may have some people receive it and say, well, what can you offer the United Methodist Church? You see what good can come if it's not coming from those who have the power and the privilege and the financial, the resources at the center. Well, this wasn't coming from the center. This was coming from the margins. And for me, that's exciting. That's like, okay, Neal, you got to pay attention to this. So I have trust in the leaders. It's coming from the margins. It's grounded in our United Methodist identity, and we were talking about that at the first episode, is how important I think for both of us that identity is. And it's so complex and nuanced. It's not, and it draws us in. It's not you're either in or out. No, it draws us in. And so that's what attracted to me to say I more and more believe that this is the very best way for the United Methodist Church to move forward, to hold the church in unity, maintain our and to expand our diversity, to decentralize and yet maintain the common pieces that hold us together as United Methodists, whether it's the agencies or all the institutions that we so rely on, and our social principles. Certainly, I think that had there been discussion of the social principles as a contextual document, I would have been more wary. But from the very beginning, the Christmas Covenant affirmed the social principles as a document for the whole church. And I thought that's risk-taking, because it's a prophetic challenge to the whole church to go beyond its own region and yet to be regional in its expression of social justice, but to go beyond itself and to stay connected. That's how I see the social principles. They're not like... this is where I think we've done significant improvement from the current social principles. They're much more contextual now. They speak to the whole church and the context, and so at the same time. And that's what the Christmas Covenant is trying to do. Give the freedom, and then at the same time maintain certain structures necessary for us to stay a United Methodist Church.
So I'm curious, as you're thinking about your work with the Christmas Covenant team and the broader conversation of regionalization that you've heard, what do you think might be the threats, or what are the things that we've got to really think about critically and really talk about deeply as a church if we really want to see regionalization pass, yes, General Conference, but really be something that the church would embrace?
I think that conferences and local churches need to see what difference it'll make for them. That's the embracing piece, because we can pass a general conference, but if a conference doesn't sort of explore, well, what difference does it make for us? Where my local church that I attend says, well, now what's the difference? We've been doing what we're doing. We're following our conscience. And that can go for churches along the theological perspective in terms of what they are willing to do or not do. I think the challenge is asking that question to conferences and local churches. What difference will regionalization make? And for me, I look at the U.S. as a region and the opportunity to have conversations that we couldn't otherwise have more intentionally, that otherwise we would wait till General Conference to have. I was talking with someone this week where I said it's unfortunate because of the 2019 General Conference, we don't have a major initiative in the church, right? We Imagine No Malaria was this visionary vision for the global church that we could all buy into at some level. We could disagree theologically in some ways. We don't have to be a huge church. We can be a modest church, small member church, large member church. We all participate. And I was fortunate in that I worked on the Imagine No Malaria campaign with colleagues that were doing the policy work. So advocating to Congress to also step up its funding around healthcare. So we did that as part of our contribution as Church and Society, and I'm proud of that. And I remember taking a group of 50 African United Methodists who had immigrated to the United States, stayed in the U.S., who are now serving churches as clergy, to do advocacy on Capitol Hill and to talk about Imagine No Malaria. So that was powerful. They never expected Africans to talk about Imagine No Malaria from the worldwide United Methodist Church. Those are things I think we can do. We still can do that. But where is it? Where is the initiative? Our energy, our time, our resources, our wisdom, it's been invested in now. Where do we go from the disaffiliations to what the future structure of the United Methodist Church will look like? Wow. And that's really unfortunate. We've sort of put off a prophetic vision for the church. Where's the initiative? Wow. What is it other people can now look back and say, between 2019 and 2023, What did the United Methodist Church
Oh,
focus on?
oh, Neal. Oh,
I'm sorry to say it, but it's the truth. What are my siblings who are Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Presbyterian, UCC, Episcopalian say, your church, Neal, 2019-23, what did you do in the world? You've done amazing life-giving ministries at the local level, perhaps. You've changed lives. You've changed communities. But as a church, with the resources you've got, what did you do? There's something biblical in that, right? The steward asking, the servant, the person who's been hired, what did you do with the resources I gave you? So we're going to have to, I think we need to be held accountable for that as a church. Honestly, it's like, what have we done? And so that's why the Christmas covenant is saying, this is not a way out. It's a way of seeing who we are differently. We begin with our common values. We affirm our theological task, our doctrinal heritage, our social principles. What if we look at all of our, and this is where I'm coming from, why don't we look at all the ministries through the lens of our contextual theological task? Look at it through the lens of our social principles. Let's look at it through the lens of our doctrinal heritage. Like this is who we are. And what would it look like for the region, U.S. as a region, to have meaningful conversation and commitments around gun violence prevention, climate justice that's impacting us at every level in the United States, voter suppression in the United States. You name the issue, lack of access, or curtailed access for women to full range of health care that they need. We need to have those conversations. They may not be the same kind of conversations my siblings in Nigeria or Liberia or Congo or Zimbabwe want to have right now. They've got their own. And so we've got to have them. And we don't have a space for that as a region. So I would love to see us do that so that when we come together at General Conference, we're coming having had those conversations and commitments, and we're coming to the common table. The majority of, as you know, and people have said this to you, so much of what happens at General Conference has nothing. It has to do with the United States. It's U.S. centric. Decisions are made. Pensions are voted on by delegates from around the world, but they're U.S. pensions they're voting on, right? Let's sift out what is not truly connectional and worldwide, and let the regions do the business they need to do. Give them the freedom to do it. Let ministry happen and flourish contextually, recognizing we will not agree completely on every issue, and nor do we need to. We can still be in relationship with each other. So can we celebrate one another's ministry? So, yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I'm just reflecting on the range of emotions you just put me through. No, it's good. It's fine. Good? It's totally fine. So you've already done a little bit of this, but connect me now to the revised social principles,
sure.
Which is, the work that started before 2019, obviously. Yep. But tell me the whole thing's important.
Yeah.
But tell me, what are the top line important pieces that people listening to this podcast really want to think about as we, begin to look forward to General Conference?
Absolutely. The first 4 years were spent listening. The best spiritual discipline is listening. It's practicing curiosity.
Agreed.
It's practicing empathy, validation where we disagree, still validating people's perspectives, looking at where the narratives, scripture, tradition are, what's the very best of our critical understanding of the world around us, or reason and our own personal and lived and collective experience. How does that inform what we believe, how we're going to practice and behave together, right? So 4 years, that was what we did. And we did that by bringing diverse groups together. And then what we heard was, yes, the social principles are a valuable resource for ministry and mission. Yes, they need to be theologically grounded and scripturally grounded. And in places there's a need to address this. And thirdly, yes, they ought to be more worldwide, because right now they seem to reflect one cultural understanding. So how can they be much more worldwide in application? So after the 4 years of listening, the 4 years of writing, and then drafting, and then more drafting. So if I give you some statistics, we're talking about, over 4,000 individual comments that came in on a final draft, a first draft that was translated into multiple languages and made public so that anyone could access it. Public conversations held in church parlors and basements and theological schools and colleges and global young people's convocation and caucus meetings, and where United Women in Faith, before that United Methodist Women, met. So final draft was created, new structure, I think, which is really exciting, revised language that now is categorized into the community of all creation, the social community, the economic community, and the political community, and several new social principles that I would lift up to you on sustainability, the agency of indigenous peoples, environmental racism, food justice, traditional wisdom, and affirming science. So really, again, voices that otherwise would have been marginalized have now been brought to the center. New language on child marriage, on polygamy, on colonialism and neocolonialism, and so on, even on war and military service, new language that shifted. New structure of the social principles, beginning with a quote from John Wesley, specific scripture to ground the principles, naming the problems, and then looking at our responses. So sort of a consistency in the structure itself, the metastructure. And then really the understanding that this is a contextual document ultimately, and that it ought to be accessible to lay people, clergy, someone who's not United Methodist. One of the disciplines, practices we had early on was to show the document to people who are not part of the United Methodist Church and to say, does this make sense to you? What's missing here? What would you include? And taking the revised social principles then and looking at the current social principles and then previous iterations, because remember, the social principles were written in 1968. There's been no whole cloth revision since 1968. And in 68, there was a lot happening. General Conference convened 2 weeks after Dr. King was assassinated. So it was this urgency at that General Conference, especially on the social principles, to pass something that would really speak to the prophetic now, really in the language of Bishop James Thomas, who chaired the first social principles writing committee. The other piece is that this is really worldwide. So the social principles have changed every 4 years, but there has not been that intentionality to really do a revision from across borders and boundaries. This was the priority from the very beginning, that this would not be one group of scholars writing it, or would not be based in the United States. So I think even in that, in terms of the locations, and then the public conversations, and then the feedback, I don't think a document in the Methodist Church has gone through this kind of a process. This is the first time I think this kind of a document has been produced this way. So,
That's helpful. It's so helpful. And a lot. It's helpful, but it's a lot.
It's a lot.
So let me ask this question, Neal, and it's an unfair question after all we've talked about, to be honest, but I'll ask it anyway. With all that you've worked on and all that you've been a part of, what do you think General Conference 2020 that will be held in April and May of 2024 needs to be about?
So I think priority is addressing the harm that was done in 2019 and fixing what we broke. We've been a broken church for some time, but we really broke the church. We tried to break the church, and people have been living in that space since then. They've been living in it for generations, but now it's out in the open. And so how do we heal that? How do we repair that? So that's number one. But that's connected to other pieces. So I can't see that the change in harmful language in the book of discipline and in the social principles, I don't see that as separate from revisiting our commitments. And so how do we revisit our commitments? Is through passing the social principles, new social principles. How do we repair the harm that's been done in the United Methodist Church? It's through creating a structure that can allow us to flourish and love and respect each other. And regionalization is the way to do that. Whether it's the Christmas covenant or some version of the Christmas covenant that's passed. We've got to learn to love each other again. We've got to learn to see each other's human dignity and see it not as a threat. And that we're not in a place as a church to be in full agreement on anything. So that ought not to be the priority. We're not full agreement. No, it's freedom and unity. That's where this church is. Other churches are in different places. We're talking about the United Methodist Church. So, and I do believe in the worldwide church. I believe that we are stronger, we are more effective, we are better with our global voice. And so I don't want to lose any part of the worldwide United Methodist Church. And part of the reason I say that is because I've been so influenced by the people from outside my own country, my own borders, that their struggles are similar to our struggles. We don't want to abandon one another, right? So that's my hope.
Neal, I just am really grateful for your passion for the church, and the energy that you've brought to this conversation. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Derek.
This has just been a rich conversation.
I apologize for anything I did not cover that I ought to have covered, and those who are listening, but there's more to the conversation.
Always so much more.
Always more. But for today, I'm deeply grateful for the questions you've asked and the opportunity to be able to share some from one perspective.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Bar of the Conference is produced by the team at Wesley's Revival, a ministry of Studio Wesley. Subscribe to this show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google platforms so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.